I didn't like Resurrection F all that much, but given I wouldn't make a video on it for another 10 years, not enough people were warned against it to keep it from performing well. It was the #1 movie in Japan the week it premiered in 2015 and outperformed Battle of Gods. After 2 internationally successful films, Something Something Irons, Something Something Striking, Something Something Hot. 10 days after the release of the film, Toei Animation announced that production was underway on the first new Dragon Ball television series since Dragon Ball GT had ended in 1997. Dragon Ball Super is here, and it's time to talk about what it is in the first installment of 2025's Dragon Ball Dissection December. Welcome to the 13th annual Dragon Ball Dissection December, my month-long Dragon Ball Dissection Marathon. You're getting 5 new Dragon Ball Dissection videos on the 11th, the 18th, Christmas Day, New Year's Eve, and of course, today. They're also available a week early to $10 and up patrons, which means they're watching the next installment right now. For 10 years, I primarily dissected the original Dragon Ball manga. I continued on to GT, which we finished up in last year's DBD December. All this year, I've traveled down the road to revival, exploring big milestones in the early 21st century, some well-known and some less well-known. And now we're finally here, officially in the realm of Dragon Ball Super. Let's not waste any more time, let's go! What is Super? 3 years ago, I made a similar video when I started Dragon Ball GT, and while there were many avenues I explored in that video, Dragon Ball GT is probably the simplest Dragon Ball product to define. It's a TV show that ran from 1996 to 1997. That's it. 64 episodes, 1 double-length special. No manga, no movies. When you get into GT, there is no confusion about what it is you're watching. Dragon Ball Super is the complete opposite of that. Dragon Ball Super is a TV show that ran from 2015 to 2018. It's also a manga that ran from 2015 to 2024, and also came back briefly in 2025. It might still come back. It's 2 movies, but there are also 2 other movies under the Dragon Ball Z branding that are part of the story included in Super. Those branches of Dragon Ball Super can be vastly different from each other. They clash, but also intertwine. And that's before we even get into what it means to people who have experienced it. Is Dragon Ball Super a long-awaited revival of their favorite franchise? A high point of weekly viewing and community building? To some it is. To others, it's the selling out of Dragon Ball into safe, regurgitated nostalgia. But to some generations of fans, it is Dragon Ball. It and maybe Dragon Ball Kai. Dragon Ball turned 40 years old last year. With that much time and that many stories, it's a lot of things to a lot of different people. Over the past several years, I've wondered if I'm even the right person to talk about this series. Dragon Ball Dissection is older than Dragon Ball Super. I'm not the target audience. If my only role is to be the old person who yells, "Back in my day, Dragon Ball was blah and you kids just don't understand then what am I even doing here? Nobody wants to hear that, except for perhaps other old people who haven't accepted that they and their childhood nostalgia have outgrown each other. At the same time, though, in the modern day, it's become accepted and even encouraged that large IPs just stick around. Forever. Perpetually sustaining themselves through performing death-defying balancing acts to both cater to old fans and cultivate new ones. Star Wars, Star Trek, Ghostbusters, those are just a few I can name off the top of my head. Even children's entertainment, which typically has a pretty short shelf life as children grow up and move on, has managed to sustain itself through generations. But if you look at a lot of them, they tend to reinvent themselves fairly often in order to clear the deck and provide an easier jumping on point for new fans. Power Rangers and Super Sentai start fresh every year or 2. Doctor Who cycles through new cast members and regenerations. Even American comic books reset their 80-year continuities from time to time. Dragon Ball Super is weird, though. Dragon Ball has never fully reset its continuity, or continuities, depending on how you look at it. It has been a continuous story, focusing on the same main characters for its entire history. And if I have a primary critique of Dragon Ball Super, it's that it struggles to carve out its own identity. I'll come right out and say I think that's because of Toriyama's decision to place the series within the 10-year gap between the end of the fight with Majin Buu and the end of original Dragon Ball. And there it has stayed for 10 years, only noticeably creeping slightly forward near the very end in its final storyline, but still never encroaching on where it stood in 1995. Think about it. In 10.5 years, the original Dragon Ball covered a time period of 35 years. Goku meets friends, grows up, gets married, has a kid. That kid grows up, gets married, and has a kid. In roughly the same amount of time it has taken to make Super, Pan has been born, stays the same baby for most of it, and at the very end, oh, she's in kindergarten. And, a different fictional timescale is not necessarily bad. It's just that Dragon Ball Super has always felt to me like it only wanted to reheat the classics, slosh around a stew of Cell and Buu arc aesthetics, throw in dashes of Frieza, Broly, and Bardock to spice it up because that's what they know the old fans want. Again, excluding Superhero, I could make the argument that time in Dragon Ball Super stands still. It might as well be The Simpsons. What always drew me to Dragon Ball was its sense of growth and change, that it was continually reinventing itself, that no two parts felt the same. What I was seeing broadcast on Toonami was just a tiny part in the middle, and when I saw how different the material on either side of that was, it made me excited. I'd never seen an animated show like it. That's the weird thing, though. As clearly focused as Super is on reminding adults of a very specific moment when they were kids, I think that's also what made it accessible to kids of its day. Because it wasn't moving, because it wasn't preoccupied with the passage of time, because it established the sense of the familiar, I think that made it easier for kids to jump on without really having to be invested in what came before. To me, even though Super's individual episodes or chapters are serialized like classic Dragon Ball, the storylines themselves feel very episodic, in a way that Dragon Ball didn't. There's always a new adventure, but nothing about the storyline feels fundamentally different by the end. Goku and Vegeta fight a guy, Beerus and Whis fool around in the background, the day is saved, barbecue at Capsule Corporation, reset the pieces, and start over. But my feelings aside, that does make it pretty easy to engage with. It has just enough serialization to invest people on a long-term basis, but if they lose track of it for a while, they're still going to return to something familiar. The nostalgia pandering keeps the longtime fans around, but it's usually done in such a way that it doesn't alienate the new fans. It's a very different tactic than those other long-running children's properties I mentioned earlier, but Super seems to hit the perfect balance, at least as far as placating most of its audience. Clearly it worked. Comparing it to GT, it's certainly the more popular continuation. To be clear, I don't dislike Super. I don't dislike most of Super. I've enjoyed a lot of it. Now that I've started rewatching and rereading it, I'm feeling nostalgic for it. It's never landed for me the same way classic Dragon Ball does, and it probably never can. I've seen it all done before so many times. That's why I question whether I'm even the person to talk about it. I'm not someone who grew up on it. Maybe I can't see it through any lens but a comparative one. Maybe I should have moved on by now, given it to the now grown-up kids who treasure it without the preconceptions and pangs of days gone by that I'm stuck with. But given how desperately the series seemed to try to court people like me, it's hard for me to say that I'm not meant to have an opinion on this just because I wasn't a kid in 2015. Like with everything related to Dragon Ball Super, it's complicated. And that's just what it is in relation to its audience. I haven't even started on what it is as a collection of products. To further find out what is Super, let's talk a little bit about Dragon Ball and 90s Sailor Moon, preferably with some handy visual aids. Both are franchises created by a singular manga artist who turned those ideas into a manga series. And in both cases, Toei Animation created animated adaptations that ran concurrently with said manga series. Those animated adaptations both even liked to tack letters onto the end of the title that the manga never had. It's fun. However, that's where the similarities end.
What about the fact that they both feature Furuya Toru and Minaguchi Yuko in their voice casts?
Okay, that's where the similarities end for the purposes of the point I'm trying to make. Can we move on? Where even was I? Oh yeah. When you look at Dragon Ball's adaptation into Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, you can see a pretty clear straight line, and not just because I'm drawing you a straight line. With few exceptions, the animated Dragon Ball adaptations take the manga storylines, even the manga paneling, and convert them to television without significant changes. The main difference is that the anime adds in a bunch of stuff that's not present in the manga. That's why Dragon Ball Kai was able to make a more manga-accurate adaptation simply by re-editing the existing Dragon Ball Z footage. In most cases, the Dragon Ball manga could practically have been a storyboard for the anime. It's that one-to-one. The manga is the source, the anime recreates it. The Dragon Ball anime literally couldn't continue if it caught up to the manga. Sailor Moon is a very different beast. While the manga and anime generally tell the same story, they are not anywhere near as similar as manga Dragon Ball is to animated Dragon Ball. As such, it necessitates a very different visual. The manga's author, Takeuchi Naoko, would come up with the ideas for the story, which she would then write and draw as her own series, the Sailor Moon manga. At the same time, she would give a lot of those ideas to Toei, and they would make the animated version. That resulted in 2 parallel versions of Sailor Moon, and those 2 versions could be very different. The same characters might be there, but have completely different personalities, or relationships to other characters. Revelations and twists could occur at different times, or not happen at all. The story arcs would contain similar ideas and largely get to the same place, but through very different routes. The manga was a serialized drama. The anime was largely an episodic Monster of the Week show. The anime even occasionally got ahead of the manga, wrapping up their version of the story arcs before Takeuchi had finished. It certainly exacerbated the disconnect that the Sailor Moon manga released monthly, while the Sailor Moon TV series released weekly. As you can see, 90s animated Sailor Moon is less an adaptation of manga Sailor Moon than it is an adaptation of the concept of Sailor Moon. That's why, when Toei wanted to make a more manga-accurate Sailor Moon for the 21st century, they couldn't go the Dragon Ball Kai route. They had to remake it from scratch. There is no possible way to re-edit 90s Sailor Moon into anything resembling the manga. I bring all this up because in order to understand Dragon Ball Super, we have to reorient ourselves away from the classic Dragon Ball model and instead view it more like Sailor Moon. Toriyama would come up with concepts for a story arc, which would be adapted by manga artist Toyotaro into the monthly Dragon Ball Super manga, and by Toei Animation into the weekly Dragon Ball Super TV series. So unlike classic Dragon Ball, this is less a dynamic of a core original story and an adaptation than it is a dynamic of 2 parallel visions of Dragon Ball Super. They both originate from the same source, but neither version is the source. Now, you can make the argument that Toriyama was more directly involved with the manga version, as he worked with Toyotaro and provided corrections. However, let me clear something up. The Viz English version of the manga translates the credits as Story by Akira Toriyama, Art by Toyotaro. That is not exactly accurate. The original text credits Toyotaro for the manga and Toriyama as the original author, as in the creator of Dragon Ball. I bring that up not to diminish Toriyama's involvement, which was significant, but because Viz's designation can give the wrong impression that the relationship between Super's manga and anime is the same as Dragon Ball's manga and anime. Toriyama's specific creative involvement from arc to arc could vary, but it's never his manga in the same way that Dragon Ball or Jocko are. And that's just one of the many complications Super adds into the mix. I do miss the simplicity of classic Dragon Ball. 42 volumes of manga, that's all you need to enjoy a complete story. Those were the days. What each version of Dragon Ball Super is has varied from moment to moment. At the beginning, the animated series was clearly the main event. Toei is the company that made the announcement that Dragon Ball was returning. The manga, published in V-Jump instead of the regular Shonen Jump, was a promotional tool, a stripped-down version of the same story events and premiering a month ahead of the show. On top of that, the first 2 story arcs adapted the movies, so there were already original versions of those. That led to very different outcomes. For Battle of Gods, for example, the animated version greatly expanded the movie story into 14 episodes. The manga, however, condensed it into 4 chapters. It then skipped over the Resurrection F story entirely, only vaguely alluding to its existence. That's probably partly because Toyotaro had already drawn an incomplete promotional manga for Resurrection F to tie in with the movie. You know, it's one of those, if you want to see what happens next, check out the movie. But it's probably also skipped because even this early on, even as stripped down as it was, the monthly manga struggled to stay ahead of the weekly anime. Even during the Battle of Gods arc, the manga briefly got behind. Skipping a story arc, particularly one with 2 other versions, was the only way to keep a pace. Even that ended up being futile, though. The anime soon pulled ahead again, and it would stay that way for the rest of its run. By the time the TV series drew to a close in 2018, it was 8 months ahead of the manga. Frankly, a promotional manga that's promoting old material isn't doing that great of a job promoting. It appears they realized that the manga wasn't serving a purpose, though, because it began to change around future trunks. It no longer seemed so desperate to cram in as many panels to a page as possible. It gave up on pulling ahead and just started telling the story in its own way, which I think was a huge improvement. It established its own identity and, much like Sailor Moon, resulted in 2 versions of Dragon Ball Super with the same general storylines, but very different narratives. Then, it got even more complicated. Like I said, the TV series came to an end in 2018 with the conclusion of the Universe Survival arc. The manga, however, continued largely uninterrupted for another 6 years. Talk about an arc! The manga had grown from second-string synopsis to the sole standard-bearer, and it held that position for twice as long as the anime did. It only stopped publication after Toriyama passed away in 2024, returning only once in 2025. It's officially on hiatus, but who knows? It's been almost 2 years after all. In those 6 years, the manga created storylines that, as of this writing, continue to be exclusive to that version. In the meantime, 2 movies under the Dragon Ball Super branding were released, one of which the manga skipped over while still including its events in its storyline, and the other of which it adapted and expanded. Arguably, there are 9 main storylines that comprise Dragon Ball Super. If we include the Dragon Ball Z branded movies, the movies cover 4 of those arcs, the TV series covers 5 of them, the manga covers 7. There is not a single complete version of Dragon Ball Super. And each of these storylines might be told in 1, 2, or even 3 vastly different and even incompatible ways. So what is the real Dragon Ball Super? As I said in my What is GT video from, heaven help us, 3 years ago, I'm less concerned about elevating something as the one true canon than I am about knowing what is in continuity with what I'm currently experiencing. Dragon Ball Super does not make that easy, especially given how vague and non-committal those in charge tend to be. Now, most fans say that the Dragon Ball Super manga is the continuation of the Dragon Ball manga, and the anime is the continuation of the anime. Maybe that's true. It's probably true. It's the simplest answer. But it's not simple. The TV version of Battle of Gods includes Gregory from Z Filler, while the movie and manga versions don't. That seems like decent evidence of that claim. But if that's the standard, the manga references Mount Paozu, a name exclusive to the anime. It gives Piccolo 5 fingers when manga Piccolo has always had 4. Except for that one panel where he had to count to 5. And don't give me any of that Yakuza stuff. The Yamcha spin-off manga, released around the same time, draws a manga-accurate Piccolo. What about the parts of the story that the manga is missing? What do you fill those gaps with? In my experience, most people say the movies. But the Battle of Gods manga takes place on a cruise ship, not at Capsule Corporation. Are the last 2 movies following the anime or the manga? Does Dragon Ball Superhero the movie take place in a world where granola happened? Does Piccolo live or die in the unseen manga version of the Golden Frieza encounter? It seems we have a Schrodinger's Piccolo on our 4 or 5-fingered hands. I'm not saying this ruins anything or that these problems are insurmountable, unexplainable, or indigestible. But they do leave room for doubt in a way that really wasn't seen in classic Dragon Ball, at least not to this degree. I mean, Garlic Jr. bringing a movie so directly into continuity was a one-off. Imagine if the entire classic franchise was like that. So this is the deal. When I covered the original Dragon Ball, I prioritized the manga and relegated the animated material to a side series, DBD TV. There wasn't a need to prioritize a product that was largely the same thing. I don't think that's appropriate here or even possible. The stories, largely speaking, are just too different, and neither one really has a definitive claim to be more real or complete than any other. I think all I can do is cover each version of each arc independently, and I tend to like to do things in order. Now, obviously, it would be a huge, confusing mess if I were to jump back and forth between the anime and the manga for every new chapter or episode. So what I want to do is cover each version of the arc in the order that they started. I've already done the Battle of Gods and Resurrection F movies. Next time I'm going to do the Battle of Gods manga version, which started in June of 2015. After I finish that, I will do the anime version of Battle of Gods, which began in July. And so on and so forth like that. I know that could sound tedious. While I am going to treat these as separate entities, I'm not going to come at them as if they exist in a vacuum. Like when I was doing DBD TV, I'm going to assume, for example, that you've already seen the Battle of Gods movie episode of Dragon Ball Dissection when I covered the manga, and that you've seen the manga dissection when going into the anime, and I'm not going to repeat all of the shared points there as if you've never heard them. Who wants that? Because of that, each successive version will generally get more succinct and focused, and whatever the first one is will probably get the lion's share of synopsis. And given that the anime and manga switch places as to which one is ahead, I think that'll somewhat balance things out. Sometimes the manga will get first crack at a dissection, and sometimes the anime will. I hope that makes any sense. That said, Battle of Gods manga is probably going to be pretty quick because it's only 4 chapters and cuts out most of the movie. But that doesn't mean it doesn't add unique elements of its own. And that's something we're going to check out next week on Dragon Ball Dissection December. Don't forget that we're in the middle of that month-long marathon right now, where a new episode comes out every week, and that every episode comes out a week early for $10 and up patrons, which means that you could be watching that Battle of Gods manga episode right now. At least I assume so. You're listening to this in the future where I haven't made that video yet. This is the 7th year I've done DBD December with this Patreon early access, and I haven't missed an early access yet, so chances are pretty high. Thank you for watching. Dragon Ball Super is here, and so many things are different now. It's a whole new world, don't you dare close your eyes. I'll see you next time.